All right, nerds. I have Steve Marchand back in the Nerd Zone, and we have so much to discuss because we just finished up the New Hampshire primary, and Steve and I met for the first time in person last week, which was so fun.
That
And now
was
we
great.
have the results. We're getting ready for South Carolina, Nevada, and Michigan. Welcome back to the Nerd Zone, Steve, and hello, nerds.
Oh, hello, nerds. Tom, it is great to see you. It was really great to see you in person finally last week.
Yes, and we were with Andrew as well, which is a fun combination.
Yes,
Now
that was great.
we were trying to kind of bend your ear to kind of convince you as a New Hampshire voter. What was your decision making process like? How did you feel walking into the polls with the choices that you had?
Well, as a lifelong New Hampshireite and a
Mm-hmm.
lifelong Democrat, I was very frustrated. And I said this, I did some television in the days, the week before the primary. And you have to be straight up. Like, I was pretty pissed that President Biden put us as Democrats in New Hampshire in this position.
Mm,
Um, it wasn't the DNC, although certainly leadership in the DNC did not seem to want to push back very hard.
mm-hmm.
Ultimately, it was President Biden who encouraged the DNC and said, "Look, here's the direction I'd like to go in." And typically, the RNC and DNC follow the lead of the president. So it put us in a really bad position. And we went first anyway. And I think in 2028 we'll be going first, and I think we'll be doing it in a less dysfunctional um, situation. But ultimately, as I told you and Andrew, um, I have a lot of respect for the congressman, uh, and I do believe strongly that his concerns about the November election come from a genuine, authentic place. I have no doubt about that. But I think that he simply got in the race so late as somebody who did not have any name ID, which he acknowledges, that any window for a thorough uh, going through the gauntlet for the incumbent president, that window had shut by the time we got to the fall, as a practical matter. Um, and part of the reason I say that is I think Congressman Phillips basically said that. He didn't say that, but he himself acknowledged that a legit primary challenge would have had to have started earlier with somebody likely more famous, more name ID. And he himself had been trying to chase down and have honest conversations with the kind of people that might have created that dynamic. And ultimately, folks just were not interested for one reason or another. And then he took the leap, and I believe, like I said, he did that in an authentic place. And he did force the conversation a little bit in New Hampshire.
Uh-oh, Steve.
And I suspect he'll do really well in South Carolina. That's the reason he wanted to go first, right? So that's kind of where I land. So I ended up supporting the president, but I don't hold the congressman in any kind of disdain. I just think he was in a position. It was too late in the game to even really have that conversation.
A couple of follow-up questions. So there are, and I at the time before the New Hampshire primary, there were a lot of Biden supporters saying, "Hey, stop blaming Biden for changing the calendar. This was a DNC decision. He didn't have anything to do with this." Do you buy that argument?
No, that's simply inaccurate. It's just, I mean, it's not even like as somebody, I've got an attitude about it. I mean, the facts are the facts. Historically, the president has a dominant say in who the incoming chair of their national committee is. And if they have a strong desire for changes within the nomination calendar or even the structure of the DNC or RNC, that typically occurs. That's part of becoming the president. And this is no different. Look, if you ask people in South Carolina, I think Congressman Clyburn was on the record saying that he was somewhat surprised to hear this news. This was not something that most of the people in South Carolina, including some of the most influential, powerful, sophisticated people, obviously like Congressman Clyburn, he's at the top of that list. This is not something that was expected or even particularly desired. I mean, to me, one of the most important points to make in all this is South Carolina already was in an extremely powerful position. New Hampshire's job is not to, historically, has not been to pick the president or the nominees. It has been extremely effective at two things: whittling down the field so that by the time it gets to South Carolina or Super Tuesday, we're down to the 2 or 3 candidates that have a real shot. And the second thing, and this is the most important part, is because of our history, because of our extremely high voter participation, because we're small, because most of our population lives in a small part of a small state, because of our retail context, we are an ideal state to start with because it gives everybody a shot to make their case in a way that you simply don't see virtually anywhere else in the country, including South Carolina or Nevada, or some bigger state. And that's why we should be ahead of South Carolina or Nevada or the Super Tuesday states. It's not that these other states shouldn't be right near the top. They already are. The little state with the deep history of retail and voter participation, same-day voter registration, undeclareds being able to pull a ballot that day. These are the sort of things that make it an ideal starting point so that we get from, 10 candidates or 7 candidates down to like 3 candidates because everybody gets a shot at it.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that strikes me as just a little odd is the argument that, this was an effort to make the primary system more racially diverse. And if you're going to change it up, like, why South Carolina? It's not a battleground state. I don't know if it has a very large Hispanic population. Like Michigan, Nevada might actually be more racially representative of the country than South Carolina. Like, why do you think? I mean, I have my theories on why they wanted South Carolina first. Why do you think they wanted South Carolina to be officially first this time?
Well, the primary reason was because President Biden finds South Carolina to be exceptionally favorable terrain for him. And frankly, in the primary process, 88, 2008, 2020, New Hampshire has not proven to be especially friendly terrain from a primary perspective. And at the end of the day, I think that's the dominant reason. And now, to your point about diversity, and I do think that our voices here in New Hampshire, did not make the optimal arguments. At times, I would hear some of the leadership in the state, some of our elected leadership, that was trying to make the case to the DNC for keeping New Hampshire in its traditional position. Sometimes part of the argument was that we actually were sort of sneaky, surprisingly diverse. And I'm like, look, this is one of those things that math is relevant. We are only about 3% Black. We are only, I forget the exact number, we're something like 5% Latino. We are only something like 2% Asian American. I mean, we're only about 10% non-white. So if we're going to make the entire discussion about a state's optimal nature of being first based purely on racial diversity, New Hampshire clearly is not going to win that argument. And to pretend that we would is silly. So, but the argument really is let's start with your point. First of all, what is the goal here? The goal, at least as I see it, is we want a state. I'm sorry, we want a nominee that is the optimal blend of representing the values of the party combined with electability. So if we just held if we just did this in a way that was only about electability or only about the values of the party, we would end up with nominees that either sometimes were way out of the rhythm of the mainstream of the party, or that were completely unelectable, depending on what direction we veered in, if we went too far in one or the other. So you're looking for the balance. That's ideal. Mm-hmm. And so this is why a mix like New Hampshire is about 3% black. South Carolina is about 26% black. The country is about 12% black. So if we're going purely on that, and I don't think very many people are arguing that should be the only basis, then neither state is terribly close to being representative of the country as a whole. By the way, neither state is very representative for Latino voters or Asian American voters. Mm-hmm. Neither of them are. Now, Nevada really helps bring the Latino vote into, when you combine these early states, you end up with a hybrid that does look a lot like America. And I think something I mentioned to you when we were in person, in an ideal situation, we would have a state that wasn't too big, but that had a representative population of Asian Americans, the fastest growing non-white population of the country. And it might be the state of Washington or some other mm-hmm. state that had a higher percentage than average of Asian Americans, so that when you put that into the blend, you'd have something. So in New Hampshire, it's small. We are one of the most suburban states in terms of percentage of our population in the country. And let's be honest, the reason Joe Biden got elected in 2020 and Hillary Clinton narrowly lost in 2016 was not because blue collar voters came back to the party because of Joe Biden. And it's not even because black voters came in higher percentages. In fact, we're marginally losing some of the support as a percentage of the vote among black voters, among non-white voters in general. The main thing that Joe Biden did better than Hillary Clinton was get suburban voters to come out at higher percentages than Hillary Clinton was able to. New Hampshire, it has a very rich percentage of the population that is this, at the moment, decisive part of the population. Relatively high income, relatively highly educated, generally speaking, suburban. You were just here in New Hampshire. For our friends who were watching cable news on Tuesday night, they heard of these towns. For about a week, everybody heard of Bedford, Merrimack, Hollis, Stratham, Hooksett. These are the suburban towns that are deciding who wins the presidency, Congress, U.S. Senate, governor's races. It's not who's better or worse. Right now, it's who's the swingiest. And the mm-hmm. dynamic that is working in Democrats' favor is the suburban vote moving rapidly towards Democrats. So any Democrat who wants to win the presidency right now has to be able to prove early in the process that they can compete in suburban, these kind of voters. Because if we can't, we're going to lose the election in November. So that's New Hampshire, all the characteristics I said earlier, plus this heavy suburban element, makes it an ideal part of this initial mix, along with South Carolina, Nevada, and frankly, some other state that's not currently in the mix that would help with, among other groups, Asian American voters. That's my take.
Well, now that the New Hampshire primary is in the rear view mirror, what do you think? What did we learn from the results of that? What's the post game analysis?
Yeah, so a few points out of the top, and frankly, none of them are mind blowing. So I'm not pretending that I am going to say something that's never been heard before, but it doesn't mean it's not true. First is, as a practical matter, with all due respect to Dean Phillips and Nikki Haley, we can be more certain who the nominees of the two parties are today than we were 2 weeks ago. That doesn't mean that South Carolina may not provide some intrigue. I
Mm-hmm.
would note, by the way, that South Carolina has an open primary that allows Democrats to vote in the Republican primary and vice versa. You don't even have to be undeclared or independent. You could actually be the other party, but you can
Mm.
only vote once, obviously. And so the Democratic primary is coming up shortly, about 3 weeks before the Republican South Carolina primary. So for the kind of voters that Nikki Haley probably needs in order to have a shot in South
Mm-hmm.
Carolina, she needs those kind of voters to not vote in the Democratic primary next week, or else they will
Mm.
become ineligible to vote in late February in the Republican primary. So that's something that I'm looking for is, what kind of turnout this in a state that frankly is not going to be terribly contested. I mean, Dean Phillips is looking more at, say, Michigan than he is at South Carolina, and it is a strong state for Biden. So I would, if you want to be a strategic voter who is worried about Donald Trump, my advice there would be help Nikki Haley bruise up Donald Trump as much as possible. And part of that is if she was able to come close or win South Carolina, that means she's going to stick around until Super Tuesday. And I think that benefits Democrats. Some Democrats disagree with me because they see Nikki Haley as a more difficult general election opponent than Trump. That may be true. It may not. But look, I think Trump is an existential threat to the country. We got two shots for him to not be the president. One is the general, and one is the primary. And every opportunity we have, in my opinion, to derail the Trump train, you got to take advantage of that because in 2016, people thought Trump was going to be easy to beat. He won. In 2020, he handled COVID really poorly. He said a lot of crazy stuff, and he came really close to winning again. So why would we think that he's not? First thing is, nominee are more certain now than they did 2 weeks ago. In undeclared voters in New Hampshire made it very clear that they dislike Donald Trump more than they ever have before, and they've never been big fans. Haley came within about 10 points of winning the primary, despite only getting 25% of registered Republicans to vote for her. She lost registered Republicans by almost 50 points. But
Mm.
it tells you how well she did with undeclared voters, who she won by a 2-1 margin. So, to me, it shows how strong Trump is within the party, and it shows how potentially flawed he is among independent voters in the general. We kind of knew that already. The New Hampshire results underscore that and suggest the trend lines may be getting even stronger in the two different diverging directions. And I'd say probably the third thing is, generally speaking, and some Phillips folks may disagree with this, but the fact that Biden's name had to be written in by definition means that it was a little harder, obviously, than if his name was on the ballot, and he still ended up getting 60-something%. I didn't see the final number. I do think that there's a group of Democratic core voters who like him. They don't love him, right? I mean, there aren't people like Obama who are wearing Biden T-shirts as a fashion statement, but I do think that there are a lot of Democratic voters that appreciate the work he's done. I think he's been very effective. Combine that with another group of Democrats, probably like me, who think he's been very effective. I think he's an honorable guy who's done a good job as president, have been concerned about his age, but that I feel like we're in a place now where it's time to lock and load and go for it in a way that a year or year and a half ago, there was a space for a conversation that by the time it got to this fall, there wasn't. And I do think there's consolidation in the base among those two camps now. So those to me are the main takeaways. It was not a mind-blowing set of results. And by the way, I appreciate, we have the numbers up for Dean Phillips. Some people are disparaging the fact he ended up at about 20% against somebody whose name wasn't on the ballot. I see it a little differently. He was running against an incumbent president who doesn't have a lot of haters within the party. It's not like he's George Bush 1992 or something, or Jimmy Carter 1980. Democrats like Joe Biden. Do they love him? The passion? It's not like Obama, but they don't hate him. They like him. They respect him. And Phillips got 20% in about 12 weeks or whatever against a sitting president. I got respect for that, and I do respect the fact that he came to New Hampshire and he did the work. Obviously, I respect that a lot. So I push back on those that disparage his results.
Yeah, so much to kind of unpack here, Steve. Let me first start with a counter perspective on the bruise up Haley argument. Use Haley to bruise up Trump argument. I mean, I'm convinced that for anyone who says, "Oh my God, Dean Phillips, like he's come in too late. He has no name recognition. It's such a long shot." I would say like it's an even longer shot to see Nikki Haley win the Republican nomination in Trump's party. Like if she couldn't win in New Hampshire, how is she going to win even in her own home state? The dark red state. So my invitation to South Carolina voters is if you don't want to see Trump versus Biden, voting for Haley is not going to really change that outcome. But on the other hand, people say to me like, well, do you really think that Phillips has any chance against Biden? I would say, well, Biden is a much weaker, his support is like an inch deep. It might be a mile wide, but it's an inch deep. There's not a lot of strong, enthusiastic support for Biden versus Trump, which is like locked in, fired up, fueled by anger and retribution and grievance. I think a lot of Biden supporters are like the way I was in 2020, which was like, well, he's like my fifth choice in 2020, but I'll take him because I don't want Trump. And every day that Biden campaigns, I don't feel like he's getting stronger. I feel like he's showing that, hey, this is a really tough job and it takes a lot out of a person. I mean, you look at Obama, he aged a lot in his 8 years there. I think by the time if Biden were reelected, he'd be closer to 90 than 80 when he if he, served out his full second term. So for me, it's like, hey, if you don't want Trump versus Biden, like Trump is, unless he literally has like a heart attack, he's going to be the nominee. Or do you see a path outside of a health issue? Like maybe another indictment? Like, is that going to shake Trump's support loose in the Republican primary? Like, how do you see his chances?
The reality is, I think I completely see the argument that you're making about how look, Haley has, as a practical matter, no chance. So if you feel like you don't want the Biden Trump rematch, is it really that different an odds game to take a shot at Phillips than it is to take a shot at Haley? I don't think it's obvious. Like for undeclared voters in New Hampshire who had to make this very choice on Tuesday, it was not unanimous, right? I mean, there were thousands of. I mean, it's kind of funny. Haley got over 4,000 write-in votes in the Democratic primary. Trump got over 2,000 write-in votes in the Democratic primary. They don't count towards the total the way the law works, but they certainly. I mean, they count towards the Democratic total. For example, in theory, if Nikki Haley had run a campaign to be like, if you're a Democrat who can't vote in my primary because of the law, but you like me, write me in and let's see. If she had gotten the most votes in the Democratic primary Tuesday, she would have been declared the winner of the Democratic primary. Yeah, it's kind of absurd, but most votes. So, I mean, that's how it works. Look, it's extremely unlikely either of them are going to go. Super Tuesday is so hard because there's so little time, especially for Republicans, between South Carolina and Super Tuesday. California is in that mix. Some big Midwestern states are in that mix. A lot of the rest of New England is in that mix. It's just so much money. It is no longer a grassroots game. It's a TV game. It's a name identification game. It's a narrative game. And so, in a lot of ways, South Carolina is the last chance for either, let's say, insurgent candidate to try to bend the narrative enough that you go into Super Tuesday with the wind swirling. Now, for Nikki Haley, I will say she did well enough in New Hampshire, aided by Trump's bizarre victory speech in New Hampshire, which we can talk about that in a second, that she was able to keep most of her big donors in the game, at least through South Carolina. Ken Langone, for example, the head of Home Depot, billionaire Republican, moderate Republican, anti-Trump guy. When Christie got out, he was a Haley person. He put millions into Haley's super PAC. He said the week before the primary, if she doesn't win New Hampshire, I'm out financially. And then she got close enough that he said, you know what, I'm going to stick around. I'm going to put the money in. And she candidates never drop out because they lose. They drop out because they run out of money.
Yeah.
And she was able to do well enough to not run out of money. So if South Carolina doesn't go well for either of them, especially for Haley in this context, the money's going to dry out. And now we're California. Come on, if you don't have the money, you don't have the momentum. Like, what are we doing here? And she'll know that. And she would get out right after South Carolina. In terms of Trump's speech, by the way, the clear play that night was to declare victory and move on to the general election. I mean, instead, the whole grievance thing is just who he is. It's his part of his narcissism and his mythology. But it's just crappy politics. I mean, he elevated Nikki Haley by talking about Nikki Haley's dress, by referring to her as bird brain, all this BS. Like, why elevate her game? I can tell you, as when I was a gubernatorial candidate in 2018, I was in a head-to-head race against an ex-state senator, a woman, who got in late. It was a big year to be a woman in a Democratic primary. About 98% of head-to-heads with one woman versus one man for Congress, Senate, or governor. I think 67 out of 68 went to the woman that year, and I was not the 68th. And I had gotten all the newspaper endorsements, the majority of the elected official endorsements. I had, I think, done really well in our statewide debate. On the coverage was, we were killing it. But I didn't have the money to do TV. And she had enough money, mainly from Emily's List, to do TV. And the thing that was so frustrating as the candidate on the outside trying to get in is I was playing the game where I was doing everything you're supposed to do. But she never mentioned me. She wouldn't even criticize me. And that was the smart play by her and her team. Because if she had been talking about me, that would have given me free earned media and would have gotten people to think of it as a choice. What ended up happening is we ended up having about 55,000, about 40%, more than that, about 50, 60% higher turnout than usual, almost entirely non-regular voting women who came out to vote for women that day. It was 2018. And we did some exit polling kind of stuff with them. And what we found time after time is that they had never heard of me. And I had a male name, clearly a male name. So these two things, my opponent did it just right. Trump was doing it just wrong. Haley was on life support that night. If he doesn't even mention her and just plays it like he's the nominee, just talk about Biden for half an hour. she raises less money this week than she ended up raising. It's crazy. I mean, it's this is part of why Haley has to think. If you want to make an argument for why Haley has a better non-zero chance than Phillips does, it would be this would be kind of part of the argument is that Biden is not going to do a lot of stuff like that, and Trump is susceptible to things like that. So it's still, moonshot kind of stuff, but Trump is so unpredictable that there's a greater chance of an asteroid hit type event with Trump than there is with Biden.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think your point about Trump being petty and narcissistic and probably a little misogynistic, his supporters know that. That is not a surprise to them. Like,
no
surprise. Republican base primary voters, like I think they're going to turn out on Super Tuesday and in South Carolina and Nevada.
I think you're right.
And so maybe, well, even if Haley can't win, she can damage Trump a little bit before the general election. I don't know, maybe. On the other hand, you made a good point that, hey, Phillips entered officially October 27th. Like, there are people who campaign a year ahead of time, even if they have more name recognition, which he doesn't have. I get that. I would also say that Biden is a historically weak candidate in terms of approval ratings. His age is a concern for a lot of voters, whether it's fair or not. People can debate. And I also think he's going to have to actively campaign in a way he didn't have to in 2020, combined with, I don't think the $25 million kind of Bidenomics campaign, I don't think that really moved a lot of voters, last year. I don't think voters feel that the CHIPS Act is really changing their lives, even though I'm a big fan of a lot of the Biden legislative accomplishments. So he's got inflation. He's got a lot of people who aren't thrilled with the approach to Gaza. He's not going to be, he was never a great campaigner, even 10 years ago. He's definitely not, so to me, yeah, is Phillips a long shot? Of course he is. But he's going against a candidate that may commit multiple unforced errors in a way that even if Trump commits unforced errors, his base will stay with him to his point, to his point. If he shoots someone on Fifth Avenue, it doesn't matter. But if Joe Biden stumbles figuratively or literally, multiple times between now and August, I do think the Democratic Party will have to say, whoa, is this the guy we want to send into the title match on November, the heavyweight fight?
You raise a good point, Tom. The bar, I mean, I just want to make it clear to everybody, Captain Obvious coming in for landing here, is Donald Trump was found, and I want to use the correct language, in a civil court, was found liable for rape and then defamed the woman he sexually assaulted so much that a jury said you have to pay $83.3 million, not because you raped somebody. We already adjudicated that. The entire case the last few weeks was to figure out how much money and he'd already been found like he had been defaming her. So this was all about how much money are you going to have to pay for defaming the woman that you were found liable for raping. Meanwhile, if Joe Biden trips over a sandbag at the end of a commencement speech at a university graduation, which is kind of what happened, I think, a year or two ago, we're all like, oh my God. So that part is unfair because it is bizarre. Like, it's amazing that Trump is not dead meat politically. It's unbelievable considering what I just said for the last 45 seconds. But to my Democratic friends, this is where we're at right now. Like I'm not a big poker player, but in poker, it's not like if you just complain a lot about your cards, the dealer at Vegas is like, you know what, take your chips back. Those cards suck. Or you know what, you're complaining. I hear you. You have to play. Eventually, you have to play the cards in your hand. You have to decide how to play them, and you play your cards. This is the state of politics in 2024, and Joe Biden will have to campaign in ways he did not have to in 2020 because of COVID, and he will. And this is an opportunity and a risk for him if he gets out there in various forms, traditional retail at an ice cream shop in June and pick your place, or giving a speech at a convention, or even governing in very public ways, right? That's a form of campaigning in its own way, but in public ways. If he demonstrates vigor, command, and competence in doing all those things, clearly that will help him address the age question. But if he doesn't go out because his team is afraid of the risk associated with that, then it will remain in the minds of voters. And one of the things, look, the economy pretty clearly is in a pretty good place in the macro picture. Macro, not for everybody, but in the macro picture. It does appear that we're poised to land the plane here with inflation at that 2 to 3% area, job growth continuing at a consistent basis, the stock market at, or depending on the day of the week, approaching a record high. We look like we may be seeing mortgage rates that are slowly declining some more, interest rates and mortgage rates. I mean, there's a lot of things going on here to create a positive narrative, and you're starting to see some improvement in consumer confidence and related numbers. I think that's the math of it. But there's one number that cannot get better: Joe Biden's age. In 9 months, I know that he will be 9 months older than he is right now, because or else it's even worse, right? I mean, there's two choices here for all of us, by the way. And so I think the party, the President Biden, his team have to think about how to address that, because at this point, I believe that is going to be the greatest obstacle to his reelection. It's not going to be the economy. At the end of the day, I don't even think it's going to be foreign policy, although clearly there's some issues there. I actually think it's going to be if a critical percentage of voters are so concerned about his age that they feel like they just can't go there. And it doesn't take 20%. If the wrong 5% of voters, in the swing area feel that way, that's enough. So I feel like it's something that they can address tactically, because you obviously can't address it genealogically.
Yeah.
The math is the math. So that's what I worry about the most in a lot of ways.
I agree with you. And I think that's why people, while they have some questions about Trump's age, because he's no spring chicken either, they kind of give him a pass because they see him out there making a case, forcefully arguing against his opponents, and just having still like a fair amount of energy, whereas we don't see that with Biden so far. Maybe they're getting him ready for a big rollout, but his appearances seem to be a little bit more controlled, and I hate to use a Trump term, a little low energy in my view. But you think there will be like a kind of second wind that we're going to see out of Joe?
Like I think we need to. I think that because it would help address the primary issue impediment to his reelection. I mean, it's either going to be the economy, foreign policy, the border, Um, and I'll put the border in with kind of a broader Republican narrative of law and order, because right there's some you could envelop into that. Some crime, although crime numbers went down in 2023, violent crime went down, but there's a general sense, particularly in urban areas, that things are not in where they need to be. So I'll kind of lump that into a law and order bucket. But I actually think by the time we get to election day, I think the economy will be in a place where it'll be largely neutralized, if not an asset for Biden. I think the border, Republicans are making a mistake here. Biden, I thought, did a really tactically smart thing yesterday. And by the way, probably good policy too, when he said, look, we got this deal basically in the Senate to get Ukraine money and border security funding and assets in the same package. McConnell wants it. There's definitely the votes there. And the House has said, I can't do it. We don't want to do it because Trump is like, hey, if you solve the border before the election, I can't use it. I mean, they're saying it out loud. If you sign, and after I sign it, I will close the border, I think was his exact words, the next day. So he's kind of on that. He made a pledge yesterday. He's like, I will do exactly what you've been saying you want me to do the day after you give me this bill to sign. I think that the border could be largely neutralized by election day. The one thing, again, is the age. And I think the way he deals with that is he gets out there and he shows command. Look, does he look older than Donald Trump? Like in terms of the lines on his face and his gait? Yeah, he does. And like that is what it is. I mean, he looks older than my dad. My dad is 78. My dad's in really good shape. Like I think Biden health-wise is in great shape, but he looks older. I think he's in better shape than Trump. I mean, can anybody doubt that he's not in better physical condition, like his heart, his blood pressure and so forth, than Donald Trump? Of course. But Trump, the hair, which is, I can't believe I'm talking about Donald Trump's hair this way. Just everything. Trump looks a little younger and he talks a little more, so that's what it is. It's not even the birth certificate. Right? I mean, look, we're all worried about Mitch McConnell's age because he's had some, that one is a health thing. He appears to have had some legitimate, and I wish him well, right? I don't want anybody to fall into, illness or degraded physical status, but it's very concerning that Mitch McConnell's had these episodes in public. Nancy Pelosi is as old as all these people, and she seems to be in remarkable health and is still in firm command in terms of her, she has a lot of vigor when she's on the TV and in public. So it's not just the birth certificate. I mean, Clint Eastwood, I think, is still making movies, directing films and stuff.
Yeah.
So, and he's like 92 or something. So it's not the age as much, it's the vibe. And I think he can address the vibe by getting out there more and showing command. I think he has to.
So do you think because of this, I will close the border statement, that I'm showing here a chart of monthly migrant encounters on the southern border, that basically this will insulate Biden from criticism on how he's managed the border, because he'll say, hey, I was trying to do it and the Republicans wouldn't let me. I mean, personally, I would feel like, well, man, you're in your third term. Like, you could have done a little more on the border earlier. You could have done more, proposed more comprehensive immigration reform earlier. I know Kamala Harris was involved in helping solve root cause of immigration issues, but it doesn't seem like they have a great record of accomplishment there. But I do kind of agree with you that, yeah.
I agree with you, Tom. I mean, look, ultimately, we're at and look, I'm the son of immigrants, and all disclaimers, But it's pretty clear that we don't have control on the southern border right now. This is not how it's supposed to work. And by the way, Donald Trump, I mean, he'll take credit for the incredibly low migrant border crossing. In that chart you just put up, if you look at the end of the Trump term, how low the numbers were. Well, yeah, but it's because of COVID. I mean, COVID took numbers that were going down, to be fair, and dropped them through the floor. I mean, it's a thing where Trump will talk about, gas was below $2 a gallon by the end of my term. And I'm like, yeah, because nobody drove. I mean, there was a period of time where barrels of oil were actually negative priced. They were below $0. They couldn't get rid of it. They were paying people for a couple months. OPEC was paying people to take their oil. So yeah, gas is going to be $1.60 a gallon. But but then he also needs to take, quote, credit for the fact that unemployment was above 11% at the same time that gas was $1.70 a gallon and migrant crossings were at 16,000 a month or a day or whatever. You can't only cherry pick the things that sound good out of context. You also, I would argue, I wish Democrats would do this. I'll give you $1.70 a gallon if you give me 11% unemployment. Like you either get both or you get neither. It's because of COVID. And but look, I wish that this bill would get to the desk. And I do think it would make a difference. And I think that would help President Biden's reelection. Let's be honest. This is why they don't want to do it in the House. The statement is marginally helpful. It implies that people are actually paying a lot of attention. And I don't want to overstate that. Most people are not paying close attention to Joe Biden's press releases on a Friday evening or any other day of the week. But it would marginally help. And I think we need other Democrats. I say as a Democrat, we need other Democrats to speak in a common voice. Don't deny that we have something. We got to work on the border. Like you can't deny it. But we got to get on it, and we have a proposal here in Washington that would get on it in a bipartisan way, and the U.S. Senate's prepared to act on it. So it's the House,
Yeah, I mean, I obviously two things. I too am a son of immigrants, and I believe this. What makes this country great is the diversity that we have, and the fact that we attract folks who are looking to kind of seek the American dream and contribute to the country's future. I will also say that I think this border issue may be one of the hardest things for the Biden administration to defend. And I disagree with Elon Musk on a lot of things, especially politically. I mean, he shared this video that's gotten 30 million views from the southern border. And this is not how immigration is designed to work. These cannot all be legitimate asylum applicants. And we know this because the results of asylum proceedings are, 90% are rejected. And so we know these visuals are going to be used by the Republicans. And I do feel like the Biden administration's desire to distance themselves from kind of the racist undertones of the Trump immigration, Muslim ban, the people coming from the South are all rapists and murderers. I think it was Trump made the border so partisan and toxic that Biden felt like, well, I can't do anything on the border because I don't want to be associated with cages and whatever. But it really would have been great to have a bipartisan, balanced approach with someone who would say, hey, we do need more border security, and we do want more legal immigration, and we need to reform this asylum application process. But neither Trump nor Biden are saying that. They're, you got one that wants to build like an alligator moat, and the other one that's saying this is not a problem, that it's under control, and it's not under control.
I agree with all that. And one challenge that I believe Democrats have had, and I put President Biden in this camp as well, has been this overly simplistic narrative that shows itself in multiple ways. one of them in this case is we can't look like we're too tough on immigration because it will hurt us with non-white voters. And I'm like, actually, if you look at the numbers, there's really that's not true. Like, I mean, it's just there's a connection being made there, that a working class Latino voter, in Arizona, or for that matter, go far north of the border, in the industrial Midwest or in New York or whatever, that they, because they're Latino, whether they're immigrant, children of immigrant, grandchildren of immigrant, whatever, that somehow they're going to hold it against Democrats, if we're actually going to tighten up the border, and well, as you say, greatly respecting legal immigration as arguably the ultimate jet fuel for the American economy, for entrepreneurship and innovation, everything. So, and there's the data are clear. That's not true. Too often, I will see Democratic strategists, or we need to get more women vote for Democrats at higher percentages than men vote for Democrats. And that, broadly speaking, is true, at least for right now, and it has been for a while. So the way to optimize our vote is to have more women as nominees. I'm like, well, maybe, like, if the best candidate that we can run happens to be a woman, then you should run the best candidate. You should run the candidate who has the best narrative, the money, the experience, the skills, political skills, all the things that go into it, relationships. But women just don't vote for women just because they're women. And there's plenty of polling that, I mean, well, I'll put it this way: if that were true, then why do we oppose women who oppose choice in the Republican Party, like Marsha Blackburn, the pretty conservative senator from Tennessee? She's a woman, but I think she's not. I think she's wrong on almost everything. Like, life is more complicated than simply taking one or even two immutable characteristics of a person and lopping a big set of assumptions about their belief system, life experiences, political positions. And when we oversimplify that, not only is it potentially pretty condescending if we're not careful, it's also not helpful to doing the thing that we're trying to do here, which is win some elections and then make a positive difference while we're in office. There is definitely a place that is bipartisan in nature, multiracial, multigender. There's a big coalition of Americans that I think will support a candidate who says and demonstrates it in a highly competent way, unlike Trump, that we do have to tighten up the border, the southern border in particular, quite a bit. And we do love legal immigration. It's critically important. And we need to increase our capacity to process people who are legally coming in the country. And we need to improve our resources to stop people who are not supposed to be here, who are coming here illegally. I mean, I don't think that's a terribly provocative statement, but I do fear that a lot of Democrats think that making a statement like that will somehow turn off a key voting block. And I just think the data are there to show that's just not true. It actually help if you do it right.
Yeah, and Steve, there is a candidate who is willing to talk about the border being a crisis and the need for more legal immigration and less illegal immigration. We'll hopefully see more from Congressman Phillips in subsequent states. I wanted to do two things. One is I wanted to talk about one New Hampshire thing, and then also get a South Carolina prediction.
Okay.
And then we'll take some questions from the audience. There's a few in the chat, so if folks have questions, put them in the chat. Yeah, I'll try and throw them out there. So first, on the New Hampshire clarification, I've heard a lot of people say, wow, your guy, Dean Phillips, only got 1 out of every 5 votes, which I think is pretty impressive given that he started, campaigning really in November. And he had 0 name recognition when he started. But then they say, and Biden didn't even spend 1 penny doing any advertising or mailing or campaigning. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. I think he sent like 5 cabinet members to New Hampshire weeks before the primary. Ro Khanna was out there. Uh, Voters I was talking to were saying they were getting mailers all the time to write in Biden. It wasn't like there wasn't an effort. There was an effort to get Biden write-in support. I mean, what is your take? Obviously, I'm a little biased. I'm from the
Oh,
DNC.
sure. Well, I mean, again, just look at the facts. There were 2 entities that were working on behalf of Biden. One was the much more public-facing write-in Biden effort, which did have a grassroots element to it. I don't know the final numbers, but it spent probably under $250,000. It had 1 staffer. To your point, well over $1 million, and again, I don't know the final numbers, was spent by a super PAC that those mailers, which we also got in my home, those the spend, there were no TV ads, but there was a lot of direct mail, and that was from the super PAC. So, I mean, there's not coordination between the super PAC and the grassroots group, but this also is not a complicated message. Write in Joe Biden. I mean, this is not a really difficult connection to make without having communication. So there were significant resources by the super PAC, and so yeah, there were resources getting spent.
Yeah, certainly we can agree that it wasn't like nobody talked about write-in Biden. There was 0 effort, and he just rolled out of bed and suddenly got 60% of the people to write him in. Like, there were efforts, and I saw Pete Buttigieg in New Hampshire. I mean, they say it was just coincidental that it wasn't a campaign motivated trip, but I don't know, touting all the stuff that they had done. The week before the election. So, okay, so that's the New Hampshire. I just wanted to clear that up for people who think that, like, oh, Gene Phillips, he only got 20%. Like, why couldn't he get more? I think it's pretty impressive. Like, I mean, you and I both supported Andrew Yang. He spent tens of millions of dollars running a lot earlier than 10 weeks ahead of time, and pulled out 2.8%.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one last thing I would say about the Phillips campaign, and file this under easier said than done, I completely acknowledge that, is I do think that there was, in addition to starting earlier, which again, Phillips acknowledged months earlier, he was reaching out to higher profile candidates. So there's that. But outside of that, I think there also were a handful of windows on policy where there was enough of a cleavage in the Democratic base where if somebody had run, not unlike the way Buchanan did in 92 as an insurgent against Bush, or the way that Eugene McCarthy was able to run against LBJ in 68, which some people saw as maybe the closest analog to this election. But he was running as an anti-Vietnam War candidate against a sitting president who was, prosecuting the war. And there was a tremendous amount of passion for that. There was passion for Buchanan in 91, 92 before the 92 primary. We have examples of that. Maybe it would have been one with foreign policy. It could have been. I mean, there were a couple of windows that I'm not saying that if he had done it, he would have gotten 42% like Eugene McCarthy did. But one challenge he had is, and I know I'm oversimplifying this, I totally get it, is if you asked a relatively engaged primary voter, if you've heard of Gene Phillips and you heard that he's running against Biden, what is the chief Delta, because elections are about differences. And they would say, he thinks Biden is too old.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically the argument one could distill from that is he was running as somebody 25 or so years, 27 years younger than Biden, and that his primary argument was, look, I'm not here to say he's a crappy president. I'm not here to say he's a bad person. In fact, I voted for him. If he's the nominee, I will definitely support him again. I voted with him 100% of the time in Congress, blah, blah, blah. But I just think he's too old and he will lose the election. That's a tough one. So he, Marianne Williamson was kind of trying at the end a little bit of the Gaza angle, a little
The
bit,
ceasefire stuff.
but that really was. There was and then there was the ceasefire write-in, which didn't do a lot. Got a couple thousand write-ins, I think. I mean, there's a space there. It wouldn't have gotten him to 40%, but it might have gotten him higher. But that's
25
tough,
or 30. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think that's a strength and a weakness of Phillips in that, I mean, he is a very pragmatic, bipartisan, Midwestern, third-term congressman who isn't saying like, oh, Biden is 1000% wrong on all of his policies. I think he has differences with Biden on policy. Like we talked about the border. I think he's a more stronger advocate for Medicare for all versus just strengthening ACA. There are differences. He's for a two-state solution, and he's very critical of Netanyahu. There are differences, but they're not like, McCarthy type kind of differences, or like huge, like Buchanan type differences. And it's a double-edged sword. I mean, it's kind of why I like him. Is I like, yeah, he's not like way out there on any issue. He's just very reasonable and pragmatic. Maybe in today's kind of media environment that doesn't really get a lot of sizzle, but he's a workhorse.
Well, certainly as an insurgent candidate against a sitting president, that's not typically. Typically, you're coming from the edges.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of feel like maybe he's more like a Geno Smith. Like he's not super flashy, but if Russ kind of can't cook anymore or has an issue, like you do want a solid person to get on the field and win the game for us. And I do believe, like, if I were a betting person, I think Biden's going to have some stumbles in the next few months. And I think we will want to have options. And I'm glad that, Dean's ready to go, and hopefully he surprises some people. Let's get on to audience questions. Okay,
yes.
So do you have a few minutes to hit them, Steve?
Yeah, sure. Let's take a few questions. Yeah.
All right. So first question from Jeremy, who's a channel member. Thanks for your support, Jeremy. How do you think RFK would have performed if he stayed in the Democratic primary? Ooh, yeah, that's an interesting question. Also, are there numbers to show how RFK does with Phillips or Haley primary voters? Any thoughts there?
Yeah. So first, if imagine a world where RFK had stayed in the Democratic primary and Phillips had not run. Let's play that one out.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there was definitely, and I can't imagine he wouldn't have gotten more than 20%, because I mean he has the name ID, and he is coming at it from one of those outside angles on a few issues. I mean,
yes.
Name ID cannot be overstated. I mean, it's such an important part of an insurgency. You can't. It's hard to vote for something you've never heard of, and RFK has one of the few Americans who's got that, up the wazoo. I mean, a ton of it out of the chute, and he has passionate supporters. I do think as a general election candidate, he poses a yet to be seen threat of being a difference maker in who is the president. That's not assured. And I can't even say for sure which party he necessarily would draw from more. I don't know that that's clear, but he certainly has the potential of being the difference in a handful of states, although we'll see. So I think he would have broken 20%. And it would have been a very different looking electorate. I think that I know people who voted for Phillips because they wanted to make a statement about Biden not doing New Hampshire, or about Biden being too old or whatever. But who I think would have found Kennedy to be a bridge too far because of some of his positions. I also know other people who I think didn't vote in the Democratic primary, didn't vote at all because they were kind of shrugging their shoulders, who I think would have been energized by Kennedy. It would have been different. I'll put it that way. It would have been interesting. And I think there was a second. Oh yeah. My sense with Haley voters, primary voters in New Hampshire, there is very little overlap between the kind of person who voted for Haley in the New Hampshire primary and the kind of person who would be interested in RFK. Haley primary voter aligns extremely closely with the high income, high education, largely suburban voters who were very comfortable back in the day, probably voting for Obama in 08 and Romney in 12, somewhere in that comfort zone. And then have been floating towards the Democrats. These are people that I think detest Donald Trump, respect Joe Biden, desire something other than that general election matchup, and they go with Haley, partially because they want to beat Trump, and partially because I think they like what she is, which is a 53-year-old, highly educated, what professional woman. She looks like them. Her vibe is their vibe. I think what would have happened is if Nikki Haley was ever the nominee, I think that she is way more conservative on some key issues than a lot of these voters are, including abortion and a few other issues that I think would prove that she would lose their support in the general. So when I see these polls that show that if Haley took on Biden, she would win by 10, that kind of thing. It's possible. Okay. I think she could be very challenging for Biden. On the other hand, I think when you don't know a lot about a candidate, except for what you see, then the support usually only goes down from there. And, she has supported a 6-week national ban on abortion. Now, she may change that position or she may nuance it, but she's on the record not long ago saying that in New Hampshire, most of those primary voters who grabbed the ballot, the Republican ballot, but are not Republican, that's just not going to fly with them. And so I think it would sort of go down from there, but very little, if any, overlap between an RFK and a Haley voter.
Okay, follow-up hypothetical. Let's say Haley somehow becomes a Republican nominee. Maybe Trump has a health issue.
Okay.
Who do you think would do better against Haley in the general? Biden or Phillips in a world where, let's say, Phillips somehow got the nomination, like if that were an option?
Right. I mean, here's the thing. There are so many suspend disbelief assumptions that I have to make about, like, for example, for Phillips to be the nominee, and I don't mean any disrespect to him. If Joe Biden had a health crisis next week or in April or in June and suddenly was not going to run, Dean Phillips would not be the nominee in those scenarios, even if he stuck it out through Super Tuesday. He won't get nearly enough delegates, even if he sticks it out, to be in a position where he could sort of have the leverage in a brokered convention to win on the basis of delegates. And I think that every day deeper in 2024, that Joe Biden is the presumptive nominee. In other words, that he's not dropped out. It would be more and more difficult for Democrats to not, in effect, transfer that nomination to his sitting vice president. I think, right, a year ago, it would have been easier. But if it's May, I'm making stuff up. If it's May and Joe Biden has a health crisis and he's like, I can't run anymore. The idea that the first Black woman, the first Asian American woman in history to be on, the president or vice president, who, and then she would not be who the Democrats would nominate. They'd be like, hey, Gavin Newsom, I know you're from the same state and everything, and you're a straight white guy with really good hair, but like, we're going to pick you instead of Kamala Harris. Like, that's just not going to happen. And so I'm not trying to dodge the question, but the only way Dean Phillips could ever be the nominee in 2024 would require him, like, immediately gathering delegates at such a clip that by the time he got to the convention, he would be, you could not dethrone him as the nominee in that event. Now, if you ask me, if Pete Buttigieg, I mean, even that is assuming stuff. It's either going to be Biden, or if something terrible happened, it's going to be Harris. That's the only way it could go.
All right,
And if
hold
you're
on,
asking
hold on, Steve. Hold on, Steve. Let me ask you this. Let's say it's June. Biden has a sudden health issue. And let's say at that point, let's say Phillips has something like 15% of delegates and Biden has like 85%. Are we
Okay.
saying that, oh, Biden can't do it, he's physically incapacitated, so the guy that has the second most delegates, we're just going to ignore him and we're going to give it to a VP that has even lower favorability ratings than Joe Biden?
Oh, if he's at 15%, which is sort of the ceiling for how many delegates he get. I mean, he has to have a certain percentage of the vote to get any
Yeah.
delegates in most states.
Yeah.
So I think 15 is a reasonable, the answer to your question is yes. The answer is unequivocally yes, that he, like, 15% would not be, I mean, if you compare 2016 to now, there have been changes in the delegate format, good changes, in my opinion, that have lowered the number of and impact of and timing of super delegates, the ones that are part of the party apparatus but are not allocated due to results from a primary or a caucus. And this was part of Bernie's problem in 2016, is even though he was competing on a state-by-state basis, pretty neck and neck, Hillary was ahead, but not by some huge number. It was probably a 55-45 split among earned delegates. Clinton had such an advantage with the automatic delegates, I think what they call them, that he was never going to get there. And that created a lot of acrimony, which I shared that. I thought that was not cool. And so they changed it to make it much harder for that to happen. But 15%, I mean, I'm not a DNC member, but if Biden has 85% of the delegates and then something happens, those delegates go somewhere, right? They don't get ignored. And Biden would, or his team would have a dominant say in the reallocation of those 85%. And again, if we're talking, May or something, I just can't imagine a world where Harris is not the receiver of those 85% of the delegates. And let's face it, in a worst case scenario, she would have to ascend to the presidency, right? If he were to pass, worst case. And in that case, she's the sitting president. I don't really I'm not really sure how much smoother a nomination process you can get than the vice president, who is actually the president, because it's like a month before the convention. I could not fathom a world where that wouldn't happen. I have a trouble imagining a world where it wouldn't be Harris, much less Phillips. Like Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Newsom, Whitmer, pick your national brand. Like, they're not going to get it over Harris.
Well, I could see that because I could see why Newsom wouldn't over Harris. But meanwhile, Phillips is a guy that was spending the time in New Hampshire, spending the time in South Carolina, like working the states on Super Tuesday. So he would have more delegates than any of those other people because they didn't freaking put their name in the ring. Let me ask you this, regardless of who would actually get the nomination, because I agree the inertia would be for Harris. What do you think her chances would be versus Trump in November?
Oh, a Harris Trump general? Less than Biden.
Yeah. Which is not
How
great.
much less? I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, he's just
Uh-oh. Steve, your connection. No.
Biden would do better, but I don't know how much of a difference there would be.
All right, you're
Oh,
back, Steve.
can
You're
you hear
back.
me
We,
now?
we lost you for yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay,
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, I
So,
mean, the numbers are tough, but yeah, Biden would do better than Harris would. But it may be by a point. It could be by 5 points. It wouldn't be by like 10 points. There's too many people
right.
in both sides of the aisle who vote autopilot for their party. That's why this isn't going to be a blowout, like Reagan 84 or something, or even, Obama 08. It's just that's not where we're at as a country. So whoever the nominees are, it's going to be relatively close.
Yeah, which reminds me of the other argument I've heard, which I totally disagree with, is, oh, don't worry, Biden will be fine. He crushed Trump last time by millions of votes. And my response is he won by 45,000 votes in 3 states.
Yeah,
And he
I don't
was
care if you
Obama's
win California
VP.
by 40 points.
Yeah,
It
that
doesn't
doesn't
matter.
matter.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna do rapid fire for the audience questions
Okay.
because I question
Well, I
from
need to go in
Kraus.
a few, but yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
Do you think UBI and Medicare for all are a dead issue?
No, I don't think either of them are a dead issue, but they will require a combination of an economic environment where people are open to more radical change and spokespeople, leaders who will be the face of it. And I think Andrew for UBI and Bernie, among others, for Medicare for All, were good examples of people that were able to take an issue that seemed provocative and move it closer to the mainstream. Even Obamacare, which is seeing record signups, is a move towards the direction of a Medicare for All. So we're further along on those conversations than we were 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that we'll continue to inch our way that way. And as the Ernest Hemingway character wrote, how did you lose your, the billionaire? How'd you lose your money? Gradually and then suddenly. I think that's how these big ideas work. We're seeing gradual movement even now, and then there will be at a certain moment, I think, a big moment on both of those at some point.
And see, Proust, just so you know, there is a candidate who supports Medicare for All and UBI pilots that's running, just so you know.
Yes. I'm sorry. Don't mean to. Yes. Yeah, I mean, in the general election, I think that we are much closer to being able to have that conversation and not freak out, people. There are bipartisan majorities for elements of that.
Okay, Mickey, a channel member, thank you for support. Mickey says, I understand Phillips is not on the ballot in Nevada because he announced after the Nevada deadline was over. What are your thoughts? I think my understanding is Phillips is probably going to be on the ballot in 40 of the 50 states. What are your thoughts about not being on the ballot in Nevada?
Well, I mean, Nevada's funky. The Republicans are having even bigger problems where the state party is running. I forget if they're running a primary or a caucus, and then the state is running a primary, if I have my facts right. And they're on different days, and one has delegates. It's all messed up. Nevada is kind of a funky state for all this. And by the way, Phillips, at least for now, is not going to get any delegates for New Hampshire because New Hampshire had its delegates stripped because we refused to comply with the calendar. That may change. They may eventually give them back to us, and then Phillips would get some delegates from New Hampshire. Look, the key for him to stick around and be a factor at that 15% or higher level is going to be the resources to be able to simultaneously campaign in multiple large states at the same time, or else he will struggle to get to the thresholds to get delegates. Again, barring some wild event that isn't happening yet, but is a non-zero chance. And he has to just, it's going to be about the money. Can he have enough resources to get enough name ID to play when you start having a lot of big states at the same time? We're going to know that over the next 3 or 4 weeks.
All right, next question. Do you think it makes a candidate look good, not so good, if they don't show their face yet, can win with write-in votes? Do you think it makes a candidate? Yeah, so I think he's
the Biden in New Hampshire. Look, again, for the record, I am pissed. I love New Hampshire. I think our primary is special. I think it is extremely helpful for democracy, the way that we do it. It is participatory. It rewards effort, some cycles more than others. And I, as we talked about earlier, Tom, it is true that there was at the end a significant amount of resources put in on behalf of Biden that certainly helped get that number into the 60s. All above board, I'm not implying anything, all above board and clearly on some level effective. But, look, New Hampshire is getting bluer in presidential races, but it is one of the swingier states in the country in the general election. I think Biden is going to be favored by probably 7-8 points. But obviously, I'm not just disappointed because I felt it disrespectful to New Hampshire, but I also worry that it marginally would hurt in the general election, if it was a very close race. I don't think it's going to be in the presidential, but all I can say is I can simultaneously be pissed off at the disrespect for New Hampshire and the misunderstanding of our importance and quality in the process, while simultaneously saying that I do not want Donald Trump reelected. And I ultimately decided, as I described at the top of the show, that voting for Joe Biden gave us the best opportunity to be successful in November, as imperfect as some of the elements around it we've described are.
Got it. Thanks. Another question from Engaging. Should Haley continue to run just to call out Trump? And should she use the conviction and 83 million to make herself stand out?
I would keep running. If I were Nikki Haley, let's face it, she is already on the other side of the velvet rope here. All right. I'm not saying she's in Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger territory, but right. Because but it's not about ideology. Liz Cheney is really conservative. She's Dick Cheney's friggin' daughter, folks. And they're like, oh, she's a rhino, Republican in name only. And I'm like, it's no longer about conservative, moderate, liberal. It's about, are you MAGA or are you not MAGA? And she's clearly not MAGA. And so I think she should compete for at least a little while longer. I think that she could do well in South Carolina. Look, if she doesn't do well in South Carolina, if she doesn't win or come pretty close, the money is going to dry out. Super Tuesday is a week after South Carolina for Republicans. And I suspect she'll drop out there. But call it out. Call out the fact that he has some potential acuity issues. Call out the fact that he was found liable in a civil court of raping a woman, then defaming her repeatedly and owing $83 million, most of it as punitive because he wouldn't listen to the judge. I don't want that person as my nominee. I don't want my person as president. And I think that Nikki Haley at this point is not going to hurt herself anymore politically among Republicans by doing what she's doing. And I think that she helps herself at this point. The moment of the velvet rope, Tim Scott, DeSantis, you could argue Ron DeSantis waited too long. He's already on the other side of the velvet rope. But these others, whatever. I think Nikki Haley is doing herself well personally. And I think she's also doing well for not just the country, the Republican Party on the other side of this, we need two healthy, or at least two healthy parties in this country. And right now we have about, 3/4 of one. Like, so the Republicans, we need them to get their ass back on track. And even though Nikki Haley's a lot more conservative than me, she's a lot more in the mainstream of a two-party system that allows us to have debates on issues and not crazy stuff like Trump. And I think that's good for the country.
Yeah, totally. Well, those were all of the audience questions for you, Steve. I really appreciate you spending an hour and a half of your weekend with me, as always. I feel like these are just very thought-provoking questions, and obviously we don't agree on all things, but we're able to have a fun conversation and keep it respectful. And I couldn't imagine a better guest for us today.
Well, and again, Tom, I'm not just saying this because we're on the air here, but it was awesome to see you in person and give you a hug. And it was fun to have breakfast with Andrew, the three of us, and catch up. And it's always a pleasure to be on the show. I love the questions. I love the your fans. And anytime, a little later in this process, a lot's going to happen. And let's do it again.
One last question for you. What number would Phillips need in South Carolina to kind of raise some eyebrows? Not to consider it like a huge upset, but like where people are like, whoa, this guy should, he has a right to keep going. That is a surprising number given Biden handpicked South Carolina. It's the first state that he won. They owe him. What number does Phillips need to get?
I'll be honest. If he were to get 30%, remember, Biden is obviously on the ballot here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, if he got 30% in South Carolina,
Everybody, I did not mute Steve.
well, there we go. Sorry, 30%. I would 30% would surprise me, and I think would raise eyebrows enough that, again, if he has the money, he could keep going. But it's really going to come down to, does he have the money to go to Super Tuesday? And he's going to, that number's going to have to get pretty high to get the money in.
I remember Obama and Clinton in their re-election primaries getting like 90%. I would hope that Joe Biden does something like that, given that this is the state that he picked, that he's a sitting president, that a state that he won last time. And so I would be thrilled if Phillips got into a double digit. Not to say like, oh, therefore he should get the nomination, but it's like, wow, okay, let's keep watching this guy. 30 seems like would be a very big event.
I'd be a little surprised. Honestly, if he breaks double digits, I'd be a little surprised. I'm not trying to be a jerk. All the things you said are true. Like, it's true. I mean, Biden should dominate in the state. He's on the ballot. He's a sitting president. Phillips has not been able to spend the time in South Carolina that he was able to spend in New Hampshire. There's all those factors. But I do expect Biden to dominate this primary. And then for Dean Phillips, it's really going to come down to, again, the resources to get.
All right, Steve. What I'm hearing is if we get 10%, we get a wild card spot.
Yeah, that's 10% means you've got Drew Lock starting, right?
All right, Steve. Right. Hey, we'll see you next time. Take care, buddy.
You got it. Great to see you, Tom.
Bye. All right. That was Steve Marchand. Always a pleasure to have Steve on the show. There was a question that we didn't get to that I wanted to answer, which was from Steve Jones, who is saying, hey, do you have any data on why you think, why are you so confident that Biden will have a stumble? So I will get to that in 1 second. Before I do that, I want to give a shout out to our channel members on YouTube who help keep this channel going. And if you want to become a member, just click the join link on YouTube, and it basically helps us keep the content flowing, cover some of our costs. Let me pull up our channel members. The highest level member and the biggest supporter is, I don't even have to pull it up. I know it's Soldier One. let me just share my screen in a second. Okay. Current level filter, SVP, Senior Vice President. All right, here we go. Let's share. Woo! Shout out time. Okay, Soldier One, biggest member. Thank you, Soldier One. #1 supporter of the channel. Next, our vice presidents are Bike and Slevin, Kristen Slevin. And Kristen's been a member now for 4 years supporting this content. So thank you, Kristen. And Bike, who's approaching just past his 3-year level. Hardcore, next level down. In order of time as member, Gene, David, DK, Jackalego, Mr. History, Mona, Vaughn, Yang, Dean, Galessa, J. Perrin, Dana, Jason, Daniel, Mickey, Yoda, and Unkiyu. And then at the entry level, which is only $1.99 a month, cancel anytime, we've got Lisa, Brandon, Sophia, Doris, Emerald, Ben, Shoni, Dr. William, Karen, Mai, Brittany, Lori, Juana, Kevin, Hope, T, Jeremy, David, Nicholas, Mike, Zig, Roberto Jackson, Lantern, Cindy, and Alice. All right. So thank you to all the members. Now, if you're like, hey, I like this channel, but I, can't become a member financially supporting, next best thing you can do is make sure you like, comment, and share the content so people can discover it. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, nerds_humanity, and subscribe to our audio podcast. Okay, now the question that Steve Jones asked me, like, hey, you keep saying that Trump's gonna, not Trump, but Biden's gonna have a stumble. Like, why are you so sure of that? Do you have any data? I do, actually. So I would say there are a couple things, pieces of evidence that I would point to. The first is I would encourage everybody, whether you agree with me or not, to just watch some videos of Joe Biden speaking and engaging with voters. And, just ask yourself, do you think this is a person who's got the vigor and energy and stamina to not only run a intense campaign leading up to November, but also lead the country in a state of multiple crises concurrently for the next 4 years. Now, in terms of a stumble in the next 6 months, I will also point to a piece of data, which is the Social Security Administration's actuarial table for an 81-year-old. And basically, they kind of predict the probability of death for males and females of certain ages. And if you go to an 81-year-old, like, the probability of death is actually 7% in that year. Obviously, that means there's a 93% chance that Biden would not pass. However, I would argue there's also a higher than 7% chance of a major medical issue. And then there's probably an even higher percentage chance of a minor or major fall, literally. Those of us who have senior, parents, like, we know that is a risk. And then there's like issues where there's not stumbles like physical stumbles, but there's gaffes, misstatements, losing train of thought, forgetting key details. And those aren't things that would send you to an ER, but they are things that might send you to the political emergency room. And the Trump machine would blast that kind of incessantly. So that's my take on why I think Joe Biden is not a strong candidate. Now, to be clear, if Biden is the nominee, the same way that, I personally donated money to Biden, volunteered for him, and of course voted for him in the general election. Of course, I don't want Trump again, but because I don't want Trump again, I want to make sure we put up a candidate who can beat Trump. And you look at the polling data for all swing states, Biden is losing to Trump by around 5 points. And there's a huge enthusiasm gap between those who support Trump. I mean, if they support Trump, they really support him, which means they will turn out. And then the Biden supporters, even though Biden is losing to Trump in the polls, even the people who say they support him are kind of like lukewarm supporters, which means they may not show up. They may get kind of tempted to vote for an RFK or a Manchin or no labels. And so, which would then hand the election back to Trump. So for me, it's all about beating Trump. I mean, that's in my hierarchy of needs. Number one, you got to beat Trump. Number two, you got to figure out the border crisis and Middle East. Number three, you've got to make sure the economy continues to improve and you figure out Medicare for all, like healthcare. And then number four is kind of more innovative policies around housing, basic income, all those kinds of things. And when I do that analysis of like who can beat Trump, who's going to do anything about the southern border and the Middle East, and then who's going to help be a good steward of the economy, and then who's going to push for innovation around basic income and term limits, things like that, I give my vote. And I determined that Dean Phillips checks all of those boxes in a way that Biden doesn't, and certainly Trump doesn't. So that's my take. Hopefully this was useful to you all. Have a great weekend, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye, nerds.